Welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. For today's video specifically, I want to go to chapter 13, verse 3, which reads, "Whoever guards his mouth preserves his life. He who opens wide his lips comes to ruin." Now, the reason I wanted to take a look at this verse is because, I feel like if there's one area of human behavior that technology has permanently and irreversibly changed, it is what comes out of our mouths. Or more accurately, in 2026, what comes off our fingertips, right? We live in an era where every thought can be broadcast instantly to hundreds or even thousands of people, where a single comment made in a moment of anger can be screenshotted, shared, and live on the internet indefinitely, and where the sheer volume of words we produce on a daily basis through text, emails, social media posts, and conversations has never been higher in human history. We have more platforms for speech than any generation before us, and we have less friction between the thought and the broadcast than ever before. There used to be a natural pause points built into communication, right? You had to find a pen and paper, you had to dial a number and wait for someone to pick up. You had to physically be in the same room as someone. But now, the gap between impulse and expression is almost zero. And so, Proverbs 13:3 was written in an era of sandals and oil lamps, and it has never been more relevant than right now, though. The person who guards their mouth, words, speech, their posts, their replies, their texts sent at 2 a.m. preserves their life. And the person who opens wide without restraint comes to ruin. And Solomon does not need to know what Twitter is to have called this perfectly. And so that's why I want to get into this, right? Guys, I've seen this effect so much with myself, man. Like, truly, man, like the words we say, our activity, man, really, it has consequences, right? It has a reaction. I forgot what law of physics it was, but it was that every action has an equal and opposite opposite reaction. So it's either a good consequence that comes out of what you say or a bad one. And I've experienced a lot of bad ones. And so I want to break this verse down now, though. The first part of it says, "Whoever guards his mouth preserves his life." The verb guards in the Hebrew is notzer, which is a word we have encountered in related forms throughout the series. It is the same family of words as the watchman imagery, active, alert, intentional protection of something valuable. To guard your mouth is not passive silence. It is the deliberate, ongoing practice of monitoring what you say before you say it, like a gatekeeper who does not just let anything through the door. And so this image of the mouth as something that requires a guard implies two things simultaneously. First, that what comes out of the mouth is powerful enough to need controlling. And second, that the natural, unguarded state of the mouth is not safe. And so left to its own devices, the mouth will say things that damage, destroy, and bring consequences that cannot be undone. That's what I was talking about earlier, guys. And so the guard is necessary precisely because the default is dangerous. And then the preserves his life part, right? Shomer nafsho, which uses the same root word as the guard but applies it to the soul itself. And so the connection is deliberate but structurally beautiful. You guard your mouth guards your life. And so the discipline flows outward from one point of control and produces protection across the entire person. And so the life being preserved here is not exclusively referring to physical survival, though there are certainly historical events where an unguarded word could get you killed. It actually refers to the full quality and flourishing of a person's life, their relationships, their reputation, their standing in the community, their emotional and spiritual health even. And so all those things are downstream of what consistently comes out of our mouths. James understood this deeply, right? Because his treatment of the tongue in James 3:3-6 is the most extended New Testament commentary on this exact verse. It says, "If we put bits into the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are so large and driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire, and the tongue is a fire. The rudder metaphor is particularly apt because a small instrument with enormous emotional consequences, guard the rudder and you will guide the whole ship. Lose control of it and the ship goes wherever the current takes it. And then I want to talk about this last part of the verse. He who opens his I just botched that. He who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. Yeah, I just think grammatically most people would say he who opens his lips wide comes to ruin, but I'm reading out the ESV right here. Anyways, the contrast it draws is not between someone who speaks and someone who does not. It is between someone who guards and someone who opens wide. And so the image of opening wide the lips suggests reckless, uninhibited speech, the mouth flung open without filter, restraint, or consideration of consequence. It's the verbal equivalent of the slothful hunter from the verse we just examined, someone who fails at the most critical step of discipline, and then comes to ruin, which in the Hebrew is meshitalo, describes terror, destruction, and catastrophic loss. And so this is not mild social awkwardness or a momentarily embarrassing comment. The ruin described here is serious and often irreversible. Solomon is talking about the kind of destruction that unguarded speech can bring down on a person's entire life. So, here's where a common misunderstanding needs to be addressed directly. Many people read a verse like this and assume it is primarily about big, obvious verbal sins like slander, lying, public outbursts, and those things certainly qualify, yes, but the ruin that unguarded speech produces is way more often the result of accumulated smaller failures of verbal discipline, right? The habit of speaking before thinking. Hand up right here, guys. I'm telling you, it was bad. The pattern of venting emotions without filtering them, the tendency to share information that was not even ours to share, right? And so the reflexive criticism that has become so normal, we do not even notice we're doing. And so none of these feel catastrophic in the moment, but over time, they build a reputation, erode relationships, and construct a life shaped by the fruit of an unguarded mouth. In Ecclesiastes 5:2, this was also written by Solomon, by the way, it adds a wisdom that is both practical and theological. It says, "Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few." And so the reason for verbal restraint is ultimately rooted in the same reality we examined back in Proverbs 5:21, right? That God is present. He hears what we say. And fewer, more carefully considered words reflect a heart that is actually aware of that reality. So let's get practical here, guys. Let's get applicable, because as I always say, that's where the knowledge turns into action, right? Which is one of the most important parts of our Christian walk, right? Number one, introduce friction between thought and expression, right? The single most practical application of this verse, I think, in the modern context, is deliberately reintroducing the pause that technology has removed. We talked about that at the beginning of this video, right? Like before sending the text, the reply, the comment, the email drafted in frustration, we need to build in a moment of genuine evaluation. Not just, is this true, but is this necessary? Is this the right time? Is this the right way? And what am I actually trying to accomplish by saying this? And so that pause is the guard at the gate. It doesn't mean we never say hard things. It means we say them deliberately rather than reactively. The goal is not to say less for the sake of saying less. It is to say what we actually mean to say rather than what our unguarded impulse produces. The second thing is to take our patterns of speech as seriously as our patterns of action. Most people who take their spiritual lives seriously put significant effort into what they do, how they spend their time, what habits they maintain, or what they consume, which is still good, obviously, but, far fewer people apply the same level of intentionality to what they consistently say. But Proverbs 13:3 here places the mouth at the center of whether life is preserved or ruined, and James 3 in the New Testament backs that up comprehensively. And so a practical step is just to pay attention for 1 week or just the short periods of the patterns in our speech rather than just the individual statements. Like, and notice, do we tend toward criticism or encouragement? Do we process our emotions verbally in ways that damage people around us or build up? Do we share things we were not asked to share, right? And so the pattern is what shapes the life over time, not the single exceptional moment. And then the third thing, guys, is to treat verbal restraint as an act of faith, not just self-discipline. You know, the deepest motivation for guarding our mouth is not the social wisdom or reputation management, though both of those are real benefits. It's the recognition that our words are operating in a world where God is present and where what we say carries genuine spiritual weight. In the New Testament, Paul writes in Ephesians 4:29, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." And so the standard is not just avoiding the destructive, it is actively pursuing the life-giving. And so when we guard our mouth with that standard in mind, we are not just protecting ourselves from ruin, we're actually participating in something God is doing in the people around us through the words we choose to speak. So, you know, Proverbs 13:3 is a verse that lands differently depending on which half you feel more personally, right? Like, some of us need to hear the promise of the first line more than anything else right now. There is life available to the person who disciplines their speech. Real, preserved, flourishing life. But others of us, you know, need to sit more honestly with the warning of the second line, not because one unguarded moment will necessarily bring total ruin, but because the pattern of opening wide without restraint has a destination, and that destination is worth taking seriously. So, you know, always remember, guys, the mouth is small. Its consequences are not, though. So we got to guard it like something precious depends on it, because according to Solomon, everything does.